Hi everyone. As I speak, the COP27 summit is underway in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Earlier today, Rishi Sunak was um, brought away from a meeting by Yates. Now, I'm not sure what that was about, possibly with some domestic politics going on. Gavin Williamson's resigned. Maybe something else. I don't know. The very fact that Sunak is there is significant because he had initially said he wasn't going to go and now he has. I'm not quite sure what the U-turn was about, if that was from pressure or criticism. No, prime ministers don't do a U-turn like that for no reason. So I thought obviously it would be topical to discuss the issues around this bit now. The issues are profound, so there's no way they can all be brought into one video, but I'm going to just basically very loosely address some of them. Um, One big question a lot of people will have is what's the point of a summit like this? Because that is happening every year now. Of course, COP26 in Glasgow last year, and then we go back to well-known ones like the COP15 in Paris in 2015, or actually that would have been the COP21, but COP22. I'm just figuring out the chronology. The first COP meeting, and for those who don't know, it actually means Conference of Parties. That's what the acronym actually stands for. Conference of Parties. The first one apparently was held in Berlin way back in 1995. So hence that's why we have 27. It's the basic maths of it. They've been held every year. Some are more notable than others. I think Paris was a big one because some agreements were made there. The first one I remember is yeah, that would have been COP 15, Copenhagen 2009. And they've become something akin to G7 summits, to G20 summits. Cynics will say they're really just a photo op for world leaders. And maybe they are. Maybe they are. Maybe they are just an excuse to kind of get away from domestic pressures. And for the host nation, it's an opportunity to kind of have their moment of prestige. So in this case, it's being held in Egypt. So that's an opportunity for President Sisi and his foreign minister, who I believe is taking the role that Alok Sharma had at our summit in Glasgow last year. The key issue is about global temperature. So getting it to 1.5% above um, industrial levels, 1.5% above what pre-industrial levels were. But the course of the world is it's not on track for that, and many countries have not signed up to these internationally binding agreements, or rather, not internationally binding agreements. They haven't even signed up to the targets. Um, I think it's very very difficult to get a situation where you have universal agreement, even for something as profound as this. Now, let me just say for the disclaimer, I do not agree with conservatives who imply that it's all overblown, it's all one big conspiracy theory, and there is no issue with climate change. Here's the thing. This is actually a very important point before I get back to the point of the meetings. Um, it is true that throughout Earth's history there has been climate change. It is true that we see climatic changes throughout history, long even before human history. Recorded human history began roughly with the Sumerians, roughly speaking, 5,000 years ago. Um, then we get into, the Neolithic period, we get into Bronze Ages, Iron Ages. It has been proposed actually that this entire human era should be called the Anthropocene era, i.e., the human impact on the world. In other words, the whole of human history has been the Holocene epoch. Um, it's been proposed that because humans have had such an impact on the planet, there should be a new epoch to designate this. But in geological terms, 10,000 years is minuscule, when we consider the Earth is about 4 billion years old. So that's interesting. Certainly, if we look at the impact of human civilization over the last, let's say, 300 years, it took almost 1,000 years for the world population to reach 1 billion, which it did around 1800. By the end of the 19th century, that had hit around 3 billion, I believe, or 2 billion. But the 20th century, just one century, it went from, I believe at the start of the century, it was somewhere around 1.5 billion, 2 billion. I'd have to look at those statistics again, but it was around that mark. The end of the century. So when I was born in 1985, it was about 4.5 billion. By the year 2000, it was approaching 6 billion. We are now in a situation where we're approaching 8 billion. 8 billion. So in just the first 2 decades of the 21st century, 2 billion more people. The world is now growing at a rate of around a billion people every 12 years. That's a staggering increase from pre-industrial levels. I mean, if we look at the world's megacities, a lot of them are coastal, and I'm going to come back to that. Cities like Lagos, Karachi, Tokyo, Seoul, Shanghai, particularly cities in developing countries, they are growing at an enormous rate. Mumbai is another one, Kolkata, Dhaka, Mexico City. The growth rate in some of these places is enormous. And if we look at the growth rate in African countries, Nigeria, this century, possibly within the coming decades, it's going to surpass the United States as the world's third most populous country. It's currently about, I believe, sixth. Um, so we have China, India, United States, uh, Brazil and Pakistan, I think, are joint fourth. Then, no, excuse me, Indonesia is fourth. Then Brazil, Pakistan are around the same population. Then we get into Nigeria, Bangladesh, Russia. Russia's had a bit of a decline, so has Japan. Um, but African countries like Nigeria and even smaller African countries like Uganda really are exploding in population. Nigeria is now around the 200 million mark. Not long ago, it was 150 million. Of course, these are very loose estimates, but the point is, it's growing very fast. Now, that's significant, very significant, because where you have overpopulation, people need resources. It's a basic aspect of human society. People need resources. I think there's going to be enormous pressures on those countries in the future. There may even be armed conflict over resources. In fact, there already is. There's been tensions between Sudan and Egypt over the Nile, um, and also Sudan and Ethiopia. So these sort of tensions over resources are going to be an issue in the future. Um, but when I recognize that there's a problem, let's elaborate on that a little bit. I do think sometimes there's hyperbole. So if you listen to certain, let's say, climate alarmists, the idea is, um, I mean, we always hear, for example, these are the worst storms in decades, these are the worst floods in decades. That needs to be scrutinized a little bit because, take, for example, the floods in Pakistan this year. They've been deadly and they've been devastating. About 1,700 killed, millions displaced. It's a major disaster, but they're by no means the deadliest floods in history, not even close. In 1931, the Yellow River flooded in China. It killed millions, possibly, which makes it the single deadliest natural disaster in history. In the 1970s, there was tropical storm, or excuse me, tropical cyclone Ola hit Bangladesh. It killed upwards of 500,000 people. Typhoon Nina, 1975, struck mostly China. It killed hundreds of thousands. So some of the deadliest natural disasters actually occurred in the past. So it's not necessarily that natural disasters are getting deadlier. If you, and this is something I have looked at and I have studied by comparing the different data, the different disasters from different decades, um, this decade is not necessarily deadlier than previous decades, nor was the 2010s, nor was the 2000s. They're roughly average in terms of the how deadly these disasters are. But what may be happening is that there's more storms. So it's not necessarily that they're deadlier, it's that there's more of them. Um, and then that gets into the whole issue of global warming and issues around that. Now, I'm obviously not a climate scientist, and I'm not going to pretend I am. I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on this. I feel that I need to be a lot more informed than I am. But I just think it's common sense that if you have an ever increasing population, people using resources, and then you have developing countries which are trying to balance out growing economies and providing for those growing economies and growing populations with ecological responsibilities. It's just common sense that the planet's resources are going to be strained, and with more human activity, you're going to have warmer climate eventually. I mean, you could even look at central London is actually slightly warmer than outside of London. Why? Because of all the offices. And you have 9 million people, you have lots of offices, those offices are using heat, they're using light there. So I don't think this can be totally dismissed. However, I also suspect there's a degree of alarmism going on, what I would call millenarianism, in the sense that, and I've spoken about eco activists, and I really, really don't want to talk at great detail about them because I don't want this video to, I think this issue is much bigger than them. I really, really do. I know I've made a lot of videos about them because I think they're disrupting lives and I think it's obnoxious what they're doing. Most recently, some of the Just Stop Oil crowd have closed the M25 yet again. They've got up on the on the infrastructure, I guess the signs that are on the motorway. There is a compelling argument that they shouldn't stop traffic at all. These people are choosing to do it, so if they fall, it's their own fault. That might sound cold, but there might be something in that. There's also the fact that I think we have to acknowledge these people often come across as vulnerable. There was one young woman, 24, and she was literally crying in the video and saying that her future was destroyed. You might be aware of this because it went viral. And as much as I think her behaviour is obnoxious, I actually think this is clearly someone who has some mental issues going on. You must have to do that. And I suspect someone like Roger Hallam, who is one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, I think some of these leaders, and I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I think it's borderline grooming. Really, when you think that these are young, often young people or very old people, um, often they're either retirees or they're very young. Now, with that comes question marks about vulnerability. Um, and if you have, I mean, this young woman, 24, so she would have been born in 1998, right? The idea that she's standing there and saying, I've got no future, that to me is, it's getting into a sort of dystopian hellscape that they are promoting into young minds. I mean, she's a young woman, but she's very young. And I think that, well, look at Greta Thunberg, she's 19. My whole thing with Thunberg is that I don't quite know what to make of her. I think she's obviously become the figurehead of this movement in many ways. I think she's sort of a cult figure. Um, Recently, of course, she's railed against capitalism and the West and racism and colonialism, which it's basically something I've long suspected that these eco activists are actually hardcore far leftists. And is it really about the environment or is there some crossover going on there? Now, interestingly, I was watching a documentary yesterday um, on Netflix, and it was about the issue of water and water sustainability around the world. It was narrated by Liam Neeson. I think it was called Brave Blue Wilderness. Now, one notable thing was that it's an entrepreneur in Kenya by the name of Beth Koigi. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. Now, Kenya is obviously a developing country. It's one of the countries that's going to be hit by climate change and its effects it already is. Now, what she done, she has devised a way to get the condensation that's already in the air, if I've understood this correctly, and actually reuse that as a sustainable source of water, clean drinking water. This is innovative. So this is a woman who is doing something very productive, um, something that can be replicated. It's a successful company, um, and she is not inconveniencing the public in the process. And she is someone who is living in a country that's directly affected by this. Of course, the whole world will be, but Kenya's on the front line. So I that's why I don't share the dystopian hellscape because there's a lot of innovative ideas out there. Um, Rishi Sunak, in terms of his role on the COP 27, critics will say, if you ask the average just stop oil person, they'll say the government doesn't care. I don't know what to think of that. I mean, one big thing about this summit is this idea that wealthy nations should pay reparations to developing nations. I know Pakistan has cited this because they are disproportionately suffering from floods and so on. The Philippines, Bangladesh, Pakistan, the Horn of Africa, these parts of the world are generally developing. They're the ones that really are paying the brunt of floods and storms and so on. Um, my stance on that, I know the US and the EU has resisted this. My stance on that is that we definitely have a role to play to help those countries. And I think foreign aid can definitely be allocated to that. Absolutely. But I don't like the idea, I don't like the implication of reparations because it's suggesting that because this country developed, we had an industrial revolution, that somehow we owe it to a country that is developing. And that gets into a whole realm about the British Empire and colonialism. And I just think it detracts from the core issue at hand, which is climate change and collective responsibilities around that. So I favour helping them. I favour definitely foreign aid directed at those sort of areas. But we have to be careful about it. I would certainly think carefully about sending millions to a country like China, whilst its political activities are so questionable. Um, so the thing of the eco activists need to remember is governments have multiple responsibilities. And of course, they will say there's nothing more important than this. Maybe they're right. But governments have to consider national security. They have to consider all those things. And they're not trivial things. So I don't like the idea of reparations, but I think we should definitely help them. I think, for example, where there is innovative projects going on, we can directly add money that will help those sort of projects. I think that's very important. We can work with those governments, try and yeah, support them. Um, but I just don't think that what environmental activists are calling for in this country is realistic. I mean, honestly, if they had their way, all planes would be banned, all cars would be banned. It just isn't realistic. And even if we done that, um, would offset the difference to the planet. Not when you have the United States, India, and China, really the big three. That I don't think it would make a difference. That's not to say nothing should be done. I'm not saying it won't make a difference, so let's do nothing. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think every country has a lot more to do. One issue I've raised a few times is plastic waste. Now, in the grand scheme of things, that's not the same as it's not the same as the issue of carbon emissions and rising global temperatures, but it's an issue. I do think there is a serious problem with plastic waste. I mean, the number of food products I've opened up and I'm thinking, this is really not needed. It's shocking. And what are we doing? We're outsourcing this plastic mostly to Turkey. We were doing it to China. China's now stopped that program. So it's mostly just going to Turkey. We might be getting rid of the problem here, but it's just sending it to Turkey. So I think basically less needs to be made of plastic. Plastic's tough. Plastic can be useful. The problem is it's not biodegradable. It doesn't rot. It doesn't decompose. It can literally last for hundreds of years. I had a bit of a debate with a guy I'm connected with yesterday. He's quite conservative and more on the skeptical side of things, and I pointed out that this is a problem in the oceans. And he was saying all the time hyperbole. Where is all this supposed plastic waste? Well, common sense dictates if you have megacities, right? They're coastal. You might get recycling and you might get sustainable waste resources, but the fact of the matter is, a lot of that waste is going to end up in the oceans. Now, it's no good saying, as he did, oh, well, the oceans are vast, so that makes it okay. If you look at a satellite picture, the Pacific Ocean takes up almost half of the world. It is vast, but plastic waste, plastic is constantly produced. So it doesn't matter that it may seem like, okay, I don't see this in this stretch of water. It's there. Often it's in microparticles. Um, and it's extensive. I mean, A plastic bag was recently photographed in the Mariana Trench. What does that tell us? What does that tell us? So I think some people are in denial of the problem. I really do. I think that some conservatives are just in total denial that there's any issues going on that need to be addressed. But at the same time, I think some of the climate alarmists aren't necessarily helping. Guterres, UN Secretary General, he said the clock is ticking. And, is that alarmism? I don't know. It's his job as UN Secretary General to raise issues like this, but I do not share the dystopian hellscape that nothing can be done. I mean, there's a lot of areas, plastic waste I've mentioned. There's also the issue of conservation of wildlife. Apparently, I just read this evening in the Times. Grey seals, the UK accounts for 40% of grey seal populations. Well, since the 1970s, no hunting permits have been granted, and apparently grey seals have rebounded. Their numbers have increased. Humpback whales numbers have increased. In the 1960s, it was thought there was only 5,000. There's now over 100,000. Tigers, very slowly, but they have. There's been a slight increase from around 3,000 20 years ago to about 4,500 now. It's not massive, but it is an increase. Mountain gorillas have also increased. So conservation efforts can work. One issue I have with anything to do with environmental issues, conservation issues, and this is very, very broad ranging. But one issue I have is sometimes it is just too negative. I think there is a risk that if there is this constant dystopian narrative that it's all terrible and we're heading for doomsday and everything's bad, people might actually not be galvanized and might think, well, what's the point? And I don't think it is all bad. I think there is definitely a long way to go, but is the world about to implode? If we go up to 2 degrees, is the entire world going to burn? Not necessarily. I think we may see some more wildfires and we'll see more record-breaking summers. Those are serious issues. But human civilization has always found ways to adapt. And I'm not saying that's a reason not to address it. But this idea that we're going to get hotter summers, so many more thousands of people are going to die in heat waves and so on. Societies adapt. I'm pro society, I'm pro humanity. And my issue with some eco zealots is they say they care about the planet and they say their whole thing is about the future of children, but they seem to have quite a misanthropic attitude to the world. So it's I don't know, I think it's a little bit I just don't think that's any more helpful than those people who say there are no problems at all and who are very complacent. So I'm neither optimistic or pessimistic. As for summits like COP27, I understand why people are cynical because often these things don't reach any binding agreements. But Greta Thunberg and co were standing outside the Glasgow conference last year, blah blah blah. Well, what are they offering? What's her proposal? If you ask climate alarmists, they would honestly shut down modern society and have us all living in mud huts, drinking vegan, whatever it is. And I'm being sarcastic, but I actually genuinely think they are anti-society, and that's just absurd. What's the point of saying that you want to save the planet if you want us to go back basically thousands of years, which is literally what they seem to be proposing. So, in conclusion, I do think more can be done. I've mentioned plastic waste. I think more can be done on conservation efforts. Although there's been some progress, it shows that it can work. I think that foreign aid can be directed specifically, not in the form of reparations. I'm not sure about that. I know Nicola Sturgeon, incidentally, has said the Scottish government's going to give 5 million away to developing countries. That may be a bit of politicking to her way of saying, "Oh, look, I'm different from the British government." I think there may be a bit of that going on, but I think it can be directed at that. Apparently, according to the Times right now, foreign aid is largely a big portion of it's being directed at addressing the migrant issue in Britain. So I think that I think a lot more could be done. But I simply do not agree with this alarmist dystopian hellscape that some eco activists are promoting. And quite honestly, I have a hell of a lot more respect for someone like Beth Koigi, a practical entrepreneur, someone who's living in a developing country, who is directly seeing these sort of issues. Now, her specific area, her expertise is around water sustainability, but a lot of this stuff is interlinked. I have a lot more respect for that. I mean, in India, there was an entrepreneur a few years ago, I recall, developed the idea of having biodegradable chopsticks. There's an area. Sao Paulo, one of the world's biggest cities, I believe they are looking at using, I think they copied an idea from Austria. Don't quote me on this, I may be getting this wrong, but I think they were thinking of the idea of using cooking oils that were found in the city's many restaurants. Apparently, Sao Paulo has more pizza places than any other city in the world, and using that sort of cooking oil as a way of fueling public transport. So, actually, the human mind can be a great thing. There is a lot of great innovation out there. And as Liam Neeson concluded in his narration of this documentary, um, we can't rely on the innovators, but it does show that it isn't all hopeless. I honestly think that as society, as human civilization, we do find ways. And of course, it takes political willpower. Of course, it takes effort. But I just don't agree. It's all one hopeless hellscape, as eco-activists often project. I mean, they're like a cult. They're not really offering solutions. Um, so I don't have much time for them, quite honestly. Uh, I would much rather focus on green businesses, people who are offering innovative ideas, rather than this negative force of eco-zealotry. It's like there's positive environmentalism and there's negative environmentalism. I would say these so-called protests are crossing into the latter. I think it is. I think basically there is some very dubious things going on with the likes of Just Stop Oil, not least their hypocrisy. I mean, their flak jackets are oil-based, but they probably get more attention than they should. I think the media is partly to blame for this. Is they keep giving them interviews, keep giving them airtime. Maybe just ignore them at this point. I don't know. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. Maybe what part of the world you're in, some ideas that are happening there. I do think I mean, this summer in Britain we saw 40 degrees in London. That is definitely it's a record, and we may see that more frequently. That's why I don't dismiss this issue. That's why I don't say there is no global warming. Um, I think there are things going on that we have to take seriously, but I just don't think that projecting this constant hellscape. I mean, if you turn on any wildlife documentary nowadays, it's almost always just a narrative about climate change, and I'm not saying that's irrelevant, but and there's powerful people in the entertainment industry. One of the most notable is Leonardo DiCaprio, who happens to be my favorite actor. But the constant narrative is negativity. I'm just not sure if that's helpful.